All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
When you get here.
Welcome, and thank you all for being here.
Try to do my best.
Couple days. Yeah.
This is apparently a topic of some interest. I don't know why. I don't know why so many of you showed up, but thanks for doing it. No, many of us, I think, actually, to a certain extent, did take NAFTA for granted for a long time. It's clearly not the case anymore, but it's been the cornerstone of the regional economic relations since the 1990s when it was implemented. It got beat up every time we had presidential elections in the United States, but I think most of us didn't worry that much that it was fundamentally at risk. I'd say few of us really believed that it was fundamentally at risk, but that clearly has changed. The representatives of cities, businesses, and farms from across the region have become very concerned about the potential loss of NAFTA, and certainly the presence of some of our speakers here today demonstrates just that. And so now, while we're in the midst of a make-or-break round of negotiations in Montreal, we've come together as a group here, come together with the Council of the Americas. Thanks, Eric, for partnering with us on this event. But we've come together to stare into the abyss, to ask the question, what does a world without NAFTA look like? To take seriously the possibility that this isn't just something that we can take for granted. To take seriously, this is something that's on the line. And so the way I think about this event to a certain extent, and maybe to a certain extent also this broader moment in regional relations in North America, is something like a near-death experience that we're having right now. We're sort of, we've had some sort of a car wreck. We've all had a shakeup. We're sort of floating through space in a tunnel, floating towards the light, and it offers us this sort of slowing down of time, this moment to reflect back on everything that NAFTA has meant, everything that's happened in regional relations, everything that we took for granted and maybe shouldn't have, things that we maybe should have paid more attention to, relationships we should have maybe cultivated more. But that's the moment that we're in right now. It's this moment of reflection that allows us as a country and a region, perhaps, to move forward with greater appreciation for what we have. But remember, after we get to spend this, few moments today floating through the abyss, floating through space, reflecting back on our lives and our times, we have to wake up. We have to wake up and move on. We can't actually let this become a death experience. It needs to be just a near-death experience. And to do that, we all need to be pretty active and serious about taking these reflections and making sure that they're heard, making sure that we actually do appreciate what we have, and ensure that we actually build something better, a better life moving forward than the one we had before this crazy car crash happened. So today, of course, is a big day for the future of U.S. leadership and for the North American economy. President Trump is in Davos today, and the sixth round of NAFTA negotiations is underway in Montreal. We're delighted to co-host this event with the Council of the Americas. As I mentioned, we're worked with Eric Farnsworth, and thanks for partnership on this. Thanks also to our Canada Institute, Laura Dawson, the head of our Canada Institute, for working with us on this, for their support. We have just this incredible lineup of speakers to take this moment of reflection with us, and I want to offer my sincere thanks to all of you and all the speakers on our other panels for joining us today. It's truly an honor to be able to host you here at the Wilson Center. I want to also recognize some of our Mexico Institute Advisory Board members that are here. At least I saw some of these on the RSVP list. Ambassador Sarukan, who's on our panel, of course, and Ambassador Wayne, who will join us for another panel later today. Also, Diana Negroponte, who's a fellow here at the Wilson Center, Ryan Hill of Amgen, Welby Lehman of Walmart, Mike Lebrano of Cardica Capital, and Cecilia de la Macora of Exxon. Also want to recognize the group of Canadian mayors that are joining us today. And so Mayors Iveson and Dilkins, thanks very much for joining us on our panel. They're here with a group of Canadian mayors. And so we have some of the other of that delegation to Washington with us. And I'd like to just take a moment to recognize them. Mayor Clark of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Mayor Brown of London, Ontario. Please forgive my pronunciation, but Mayor Pednaj Hobin of Gatineau, Quebec. Thank you very much for joining us, mayors. And let me, with that, just pass the microphone over to Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of Council of the Americas and our co-host of the event today.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. How are you?
Good.
Good. There you go. If we were in church and my pastor would say it again, how are you? And we would all respond, good. Amen. Yes, exactly. Well, Chris, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for your partnership with us. You've been a terrific partner, and we are delighted to have the opportunity to work with you on a very timely and a very complicated topic. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to learning a lot from our guests and from our panelists who have really an outstanding collective background and some real wisdom and knowledge that I think they're going to be able to bring today, and we're looking forward to that. Also want to thank all of you for joining us, as well as those of you who are joining us from cyberspace, from the webcast. We have many, many people from all over the place, all over the hemisphere and elsewhere joining us, and some from Asia, if you can believe that as well. What time is it right now there? But these are worldwide important issues, and they are being followed globally, and so we are delighted to have that opportunity to be with all of you as well. As Chris said, my name's Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas. For over 50 years, we have taken a leading role promoting and defending democracy and open markets across the hemisphere. NAFTA is really part of our DNA. We were there at the beginning. Indeed, we were there even before there was a NAFTA, and we have been strong and active supporters since then. We initially conceptualized this program last year when we began hearing from members of Congress that there was not a meaningful understanding or appreciation of what was really at stake in the NAFTA negotiations that began last August. In other words, what would a world look like without NAFTA, and why would it matter? And so Tony Wayne and I agreed to work together on a joint program that would attempt to address these issues in a serious and substantive manner, and we worked, as he mentioned, closely with Chris and with Duncan and the Mexico and Canadian team here, and the result is our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you the bottom line first. NAFTA works. Let me repeat that. NAFTA works. It was an experiment when initially negotiated, and the agreement can usefully be updated and improved. That's true. Just think, for example, how far and how fast the global economy has moved since 1994. There was no Facebook or Twitter back then, obviously, but we were still listening to CDs, and many of us were going to Blockbuster Video to get our movies. Remember those days? Think of the car you might have been driving back in 1994 and compare that with the automobile that you are driving today. But NAFTA has done what it was designed to do, which was to increase trade and investment among all three parties to the agreement, including Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And now it should be updated to incorporate the advances in the global economy. Like all trade and development agreements, NAFTA is a tool to increase wealth, provide opportunities, open societies to new ideas, new markets, new capital, and new management and technology. Unfortunately, it's also become a symbol of the very real and very serious apprehensions attending the global economy. Clearly, these issues are at the political forefront, not just in the United States, but in the other economies as well. But in the midst of much rhetoric and conjecture, it's not at all clear that the economic and commercial ties that bind our three nations together are well understood. In fact, I would venture to say that for the most part, they're not. And so we want to give clarity and focus to these issues with a little ground truthing this afternoon. And we also want to acknowledge the profound, broader consequences that NAFTA withdrawal would have for the United States in particular. Simply put, if the world cannot trust the United States to uphold an international agreement that was negotiated by a Republican administration and passed under a Democratic administration with both bipartisan and bicameral support, the credibility of the United States in highly sensitive trade matters would be suspect from now until long into the future. Were we to seek ways intentionally to undermine our own trade and international economic interests, there would perhaps be no more effective means of doing so than this. And so it's at this important moment as negotiators in Montreal work to find solutions to some very complicated and highly charged issues. If goodwill and a spirit of cooperation prevail, and we believe that they will, we're confident the outcome will be a hard-won victory for the people of all three nations. But such a result is far from guaranteed, and with that in mind, we need to have a better understanding of what's truly at stake and what the world would look like without NAFTA. We have a terrific lineup of panelists this afternoon, so let's get to it. And so the first panel has already been seated. It's going to be led by the head of the Canada Institute, Laura Dawson, who needs no introduction. She is a fabulous advocate for Canada, for U.S.-Canada relations, and I would please ask all of you to join me in welcoming her and the first panel to what promises to be a terrific program.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Chris. Thank you, Council of the Americas and Mexico Institute. You guys did a great job in putting this together. Somebody was commenting to me that this is, a pretty depressing title, A World Without NAFTA. I guess they're right, though. Bad news sells, because we are jam-packed. If you're watching us from some remote location, we are packed to the rafters here. I am the lucky one, though, because I'm doing the mayor's panel, and the mayor's panel is actually, I would say, more of a good news panel than the opposite. So just a quick show of hands. We've got the mayor of San Diego, we've got the mayor of Tijuana, we've got the mayor of Edmonton, we've got the mayor of Windsor, Ontario. How many people have been to all 4 cities? Hands up. Okay, look around. Those are the real NAFTA geeks in the room. Those people know what's really going on. To extend the introduction a little bit more, you've got their bios in the packages from outside, but I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin Faulkner, the mayor of San Diego, Mr. Juan Manuel Gastelum, mayor of Tijuana, Mr. Drew Dilkins, mayor of Windsor, Ontario, and Mr. Don Iveson, mayor of Edmonton, Alberta. They bring some really diverse experiences, but also a lot of similarities, and maybe some similarities that you weren't aware of. We just finished a lunch with the Canadian mayors, and my new best friend, Mayor Clark of Saskatoon, made the remark that what starts in Washington finishes up in the cities. It all lands on the mayors eventually, whether it's trade, health, immigration. These are the folks for whom the rubber hits the road. And they are often neglected in our larger conversations about what we should be doing in our federal and international policy. So this is a great perspective to have from these folks, and I'm delighted that they asked me to moderate this. So I'm going to start with just sort of a roundtable question asking about the impact of NAFTA on your city, and also what would happen if NAFTA was eliminated. Following that question, the sort of general one, we'll drill down on some of the more specific attributes, especially the important relationship between San Diego, Tijuana, the Windsor, Detroit, and I'm going to pick on Don for some energy stuff. So starting with Kevin to my left, talk to me about NAFTA. How important is it to San Diego, and what do you foresee the problems if it was eliminated?
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. Great to be back at the Wilson Center. Right from the very beginning, NAFTA works. Free trade works. This is all about jobs, and particularly as mayors. And our experience in particular is San Diego and Tijuana. I think any of you have heard me say how proud I am of our relationship. It's not just about 2 cities, the largest land border crossing in North America. It's about 1 region. And the economic impact that we have when we're working together. And we're creating good quality jobs, by the way, on both sides of the border. In San Diego, Laura, our direct, because of NAFTA, it's about 110,000 jobs. And these are jobs that cross so many different sectors, whether that's research, whether that's light manufacturing, and oftentimes a product will cross the border sometimes 2 or 3 times before it's finished. What a great definition of trade, as I said before, that is working. Just one example. If you take what we're doing in San Diego in medical device manufacturing, what Tijuana is doing in medical device manufacturing, you put them together, we're the largest region of medical device manufacturing on the planet. That's a strength. That's a competitive advantage for us. And as we look to not just our relationship with our friends and neighbors right next door, but our relationship that we have with Canada. From San Diego, our number 2 trading partner. And so our, part of why we're here and why we're here in Washington, D.C. is to tell our story of success. If we're not telling it, nobody's going to tell it for us on the local level. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, a story of success, a story of growth, a story of jobs, a story of investment and cooperation and strength. And so as we are not only here this afternoon, but as we look forward to the negotiations that are happening and as these come closer to a conclusion, we have the opportunity to tell that success story very directly, very clearly. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a Republican-Democratic issue. This is the right thing to do for our economy issue. And it is a process that is working for us. And as we talk about ending it. No, let's make some of the changes. Let's do update it in terms of whether that's e-commerce, whether those issues of environmental protection. Of course, we all want to see that happen. But to preserve what is so important with free trade is absolutely essential. It's something that I'm committed to, as I said, letting our voice be very, very loud and clear, not only here, but in these talks across the country. It's one of the reasons that my friend and colleague Juan Manuel and I restarted our Border Mayors Association to make sure that we as mayors on both sides of the border are speaking with one voice. Because the very reality is we do. We do. Free trade works. It works for our country. It works for our city. So we are only interested in success. We are not interested in a situation without NAFTA. Let's strengthen it. Let's improve it. But let's keep what is so important to this country and to our local municipalities going and going strong.
Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Gastelum.
Let's see if it's working. Okay. Hello to you all. Thank you for having us here. Municipality of Tijuana. It's big municipality working, and you must have seen me going kind of back and forth. It's because I second what Kevin says. It's true. I mean, we have a reality. It's and I'm gonna excuse myself. Maybe my English ain't that great. I kind of stumble with certain words, but still, okay. What are we doing? What's happening with NAFTA? It happens. It's growth. It's competitiveness. It's it's wellness. It's the people getting jobs, people working, going, and we're talking about being happy. And so, what this has to do with NAFTA? Well, when you have your job, secure job, where you're going, when you're being better people, it's good for your community. And what we're trying to do in Tijuana is have community. We call it comunidad. We have to work together. And NAFTA since 1994 has given us a lot of things, good things happening to us as Tijuanans. We've been working with Mayor Kevin Faulkner, which I appreciate his invitation and the way I've told him, Kevin, I'll follow you. I'll follow on your footsteps. I don't have any problem with that. It's because we have to work as a team. We breathe the same air. We have families going back and forth. We have millions of people crossing the border every day. California's, 29 states from the United States have their first or second partner in the NAFTA treaty. They go back and forth. They have investment. It's job for every 2 jobs created in Tijuana. There's 1 job created in San Diego. We have approximately 6.5 million people living in the Cali Baja or the San Diego Tijuana region, and we create we have a workforce of 2,800,000 approximately. So what does that mean? NAFTA's working. We have borders, yes. We have the legal border, yes. We have maybe one of these days the wall. We might have it there. It's been there. I mean, we know it exists, but we're lawful people. I mean, we're people who work with the law and work together. And I appreciate and I thank the Wilson International Center for having us here so we can explain by firsthand what's happening. And if I do invite you to come down to Tijuana, come down to San Diego, and let us show what's going on with real facts, with real numbers. We're excited. We're doing the good things, and there's much to come. We do have to check out the NAFTA treaty, make it better, make it good, try to see the big vision, have a big vision, have a big issue, not the real small ones. They don't take us anywhere, but we can do it, and we can work together.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take a minute to give you a commercial break, an unpaid commercial break. This is, for the gringos and the Canadienses who are there, who have not been to the Baja Cali region, who have not been to Tijuana. It is not what you think. I got on a trolley in San Diego, and I took it to the border, and I found myself in Tijuana, and what I found was great restaurants, a wine culture, Tijuana Innovadora, which celebrates culture and innovation. I found little high-tech startups. It was truly an amazing place, and I think both cities are richer because of that relationship. So, That's my commercial.
We appreciate that commercial. Thank you very much.
So if you
Please
haven't,
come and spend lots of money, please, everybody.
Could you do it again, please?
on to you, Mayor of Windsor, Detroit. Windsor, which is, sorry, you can have Detroit too, because Detroit's not here. Also,
We're good friends, it's okay.
Yeah, also a community that is really a shared binational community interrupted by a pesky federal border. Tell us what's important about NAFTA to your city and what happens if it goes away.
Well, the story certainly doesn't seem dissimilar to the friends next to me in terms of San Diego and Tijuana. Windsor, Detroit have been, because of history, because of geography, have been close friends and neighbors for a long, long time. And I said just about an hour ago that when we look at our relationship vis-a-vis the rest of our province, that in many ways we actually have a stronger and closer relationship with the city of Detroit than we do with Toronto, which is, you know, our provincial capital. And again, that's because of history, but it's because of geography. And so many of you are probably saying, well, Windsor, you know, what goes on in the city of Windsor? We are home to, besides Canadian Club, sold worldwide in 165 countries, started by an American who took a ferry across the Detroit River, and it's North America's largest distillery. We're home to North America's largest automotive cluster. And what that means is we have a very integrated supply chain with the Motor City, with the city of Detroit, and many, many decades of history with respect to automobile production, manufacturing, parts, tool, die, and mold. And in fact, in our region alone, tool, die, and mold and automotive manufacturing comprises a full 30% of our regional GDP. And so the Mayor Faulkner talked about goods crossing the Mexican-U.S. border 2 or 3 times before the product is finally completed. With respect to automobiles, we have parts that go into final assembly at our largest employer in the city of Windsor, Fiat Chrysler, which makes the Chrysler Pacifica, that cross the border 6 to 8 times before they're put into final assembly. And so when you talk about the impact on jobs, it's not just a Canadian mayor sitting here saying this is going to impact jobs in my community. Yeah, that's really important to me, but the impact on the other side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border in the city of Detroit and the surrounding area, is also quite large. And so we have a very close relationship. We have an integrated supply chain, and it's a relationship that's been formed through this NAFTA bond for the last 24 years. It is working, and I agree fully with Mayor Gastelum when he says, let's talk about the facts. Because the facts in this conversation are very, very important. We have to rise above the rhetoric. We have to rise above some of the things that gain political traction and really get down to the heart and the meat of the matter and talk about the facts. Because if we do have a conversation based on fact, Mexico has won under NAFTA, Canada has won under NAFTA, and the United States of America has also won under NAFTA based on the facts alone. And that's an important part of the conversation that we need to have.
Good. Mayor Iveson, you're way up in northern Alberta. Surely Mexico NAFTA means nothing to you. Does it?
Well, first of all, gracias, merci, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the chance to tell you a little bit. Now, Edmonton is far from the border, and in fact, 90% of Canadians live within a 200-mile drive of the U.S. border. Half of everybody else lives in Edmonton with me. But we are, as such, a hub for the resource and energy industry, but also the capital city of the fastest growing part of the Canadian economy out west. Certainly energy is front and center, but also health and life sciences, professional services, construction, finance. And every single one of those industries touches the global economy, but in particular, the 500 million of us who live here together peacefully on this continent, and through this mutual prosperity pact we've had for almost a generation, we have all prospered. And I made a deal with Mayor Faulkner when I was down in San Diego last year at the big biotech conference, that because he's been so passionate about NAFTA and his experience, I said, I'll make you a deal. I'll talk about how important Mexico is to Canada in NAFTA if he talks a little bit about how important Canada is to California. And so he held up his end of the bargain today. And because we really are in this together, and Canadians benefit from opportunities to work with Mexican companies across so many different sectors. But I'll focus in particular on the issues that are sort of top of mind for us. I mean, just in Edmonton, we do $1 billion of trade directly with Houston and that region around not just oil and gas products, but intellectual property and advanced manufacturing to support innovation and productivity in the oil and gas space. And built on top of that is a lot of other competency around advanced materials and advanced manufacturing. And that starts to cross over into computer science and artificial intelligence, the application of machine learning to those traditional resource sectors. And as a city that is in the center of that, sort of really the jumping off point for much of the resource economy in Northern Canada, having access, having labor mobility, making improvements to labor mobility and technology and IP, those are all things we'll benefit from a new and improved NAFTA. The alternate scenario, where we no longer have open and free and fair trade relationships between our three countries and hundreds of millions of consumers and producers, is a dire scenario, which is why I'm here with so many of my colleagues from our Big City Mayors group, which the 22 of us represent more than half of Canada's population, because we're actually one of the most urbanized countries in the world. Even though your postcard picture of Canada is very pastoral, it's an incredibly urban country. As with most places, the economy is focused around the cities too. 2/3 of our country's GDP comes from our cities, and so we have a material stake in this. But I think a little bit about, really why we came here was to connect, especially with our peers at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, who I'm pleased to tell you have the message, and we need to empower them with specific stories to take back to decision makers, particularly in Congress as things progress, where they will have influence, particularly from some parts of the United States, where key decision makers come from. And I'll just wrap by sharing the story from Mayor Reichard from Macon, Georgia, who we bumped into at a reception last night, and he said, what are you all doing down here at the conference? I said, well, we're here to talk about lots of things, especially NAFTA. And he cut me off and he said, that agreement is so important. I won't try to do his accent. It's so important to our community because a Canadian company has just invested $300 million in building a plant for paper towels in Georgia because of growth in the southeast in the United States. And he described to me the supply chain for that final product, which is trees grown in Maine that are then shipped across the border and processed in Canada into sheets and then shipped back across the border to the existing plant in New York and this new plant. And he said that $300 million and the 200 permanent jobs that are going to come with it are on the line. So this was very real for a mayor in a community who is committed to taking it back up the chain. And those are the conversations we need to have so that their senator and their Congress people understand that it's not just cheap goods for the United States consumer which are on the line, but it's also foreign direct investment from the countries in both Canada and Mexico who have had the trust to invest in each other. And of course, we all have those same things on the line in our own communities. So it is an existential time for us, but that's why we're here.
I'm going to actually ask you to go on a little bit because the rest, I'm going to...
No one ever asked me to do that.
Sorry. I'm going to let the folks from the cross-border communities dominate for a minute here. I want to talk about what they've been doing. But before I let you go, Don, talk a little bit about the energy relationship, please. We've been talking a lot about trade and manufactured goods, but the energy relationship is extraordinarily important on a trilateral level. I hear Alberta produces a little bit of oil. What's the deal?
Well, $53.9 billion in energy exports go to the United States and support the smooth running of this economy. And the lion's share of that does come from Alberta and Saskatchewan, to be sure. But it's a two-way relationship. Canada, because the country is so vast and so many of our energy networks and trade relationships are north-south, also imports $16.8 billion worth of energy from the United States. And as those supply chains become disrupted, that begins to have huge input cost implications for producers who rely on that consistent supply of energy. And also, I mean, American companies have invested tremendous amounts of capital, particularly in northern Alberta, in order to develop energy resources, and their return on their investment could be impacted by barriers to the free flow of energy back and forth between the two countries. So obviously we have a stake in it as a producer, but the whole continent has a stake in it as a consumer of an integrated energy system.
Great. Thank you. All right, so let's go to these three folks that live in sort of cross-border communities that are interrupted by a federal border. So tell me I want to ask you about some of the lessons learned. What do we need to know about building a cross-border regional community? And I'd like it if you could talk to me also about some of the innovations. We focus a lot on the negative elements and trucks held up at the border. But I know, for example, in San Diego, Tijuana, there's a great cross-border express bridge. I know there's a number of innovations between Windsor, Detroit that are getting people across the border faster. So if you can talk about how do you build and manage a cross-border community, and what's the role of innovation? And I'll start with Kevin.
Just exactly that, the innovation and infrastructure. And there's a great, I'm glad you mentioned Cross-Border Express, because that is a great story, again, of success, of cooperation, where you can park your car in Otay Mesa, walk across the bridge directly into Rodriguez Airport in Tijuana. That has opened up all kinds of markets and air travel and opportunities for San Diegans and Tijuana on both sides of the border. So that bridge, literally and figuratively, is working. That spurs more investment, that spurs more travel, that spurs more trade. We just opened another bridge, a pedestrian bridge, down at San Ysidro. We're talking about a new border crossing, Otay Mesa 2, again, to help facilitate the flow of goods, of people, of families. And when we invest in that infrastructure and the smart infrastructure, making it easier for trucks, so you don't have those border waits, that is the region and again, that's a great story with partnership of our federal partners, both DHS, CBP, and others here locally in San Diego, our business committee, our Chamber of Commerce, and others that realize how critically important this infrastructure, federal infrastructure, yes, there is a border, but matters for the city and the entire San Diego region and the entire region of northern Baja. So when you see that those increased dollars and those opportunities, we're taking advantage of it. The Cross-Border Express, I think, already in the first year, over the first year of operation, exceeded the goal by 2 or 3 factor. I'm not surprised. Build it, it'll work.
It's making money,
and that, of course it is. And so as again, one of the things that you heard all of the mayors talk about, I want to reemphasize it, is that what those supply chains mean. The latest figures out of from San Diego and northern Baja, about a $2.5 billion supply chain. Again, these are all types of different jobs and focus that, in many respects, didn't exist, back in 1994. So we have tremendous momentum. It is working. We have to continue to be innovative, and particularly on the infrastructure side, we're seeing the benefits of that every single day.
Mayor Gastelum, your cross-border community.
Yes, well, it's a matter of willingness. If you want it to happen, it can happen. The legal red tape, yes, we've been through that. But it's long as we want to do it, if we're willing to do it, that's why the main purpose of us being here. So a moment ago you said that what happens here in Washington not necessarily provides the best for the towns, and that's what happens. Big politicians, big thinkers, they decide on this. On the East Coast, 6 hours flight from our borders, and they don't live what's happening there. And what's happening, it happens. The CBX, for instance, the Otay Mesa new cross-border, they're working, and we can make it happen as long as we respect the law. We are lawful citizens, and we can do it. But it doesn't take much to do it. It just takes what you're willing to do, and to get to know it. It happens with good things. Good things happen. And we can work on that. That's our main purpose, so they can hear us, they can listen, say, hey, let's pay attention to those small towns, real, San Diego, Tijuana is the Mexican side. No, wait. We have millions of people crossing during the year. Sorry, during the year we have. It's one region. We're biculturals. We're binationals. As I've said before, we breathe the same air. I mean, it's there. We just want people, or the big people, to take the decisions, the willingness to hear us, to listen to us, and get the good things that we say, that we can prove it happens, and write it down, and go ahead with NAFTA.
Right. Mayor Dilkins, you live in a mega region. What works there? What's the role of innovation?
So just to declare to all of you, I love Thai food. And you say, why the hell does that matter? The best Thai restaurant in my area is over in the city of Detroit in a place called Eastern Market. And I can, from my office, get in my car at lunch hour, and I do this probably once a month anyway. I'd leave my office and be at Eastern Market, parked at the restaurant and in within 8 minutes through the border, when the border is working as it should. And I can do that because I have a Nexus card, and there's a Nexus program, and people who live in my community, most of them would have that program if they cross the border with any frequency. The FAST program exists for trucks and clearing the drivers and the loads on trucks. And so there are programs that exist that help accelerate the crossing of the border. I know our customs is working with Homeland Security and Border Protection in the U.S. with respect to a green lane and how do they move goods through faster, because we really believe that a delay at the border is really what we'd call a non-tariff barrier. And whether that's for people who are going through and getting unequal treatment, whether it's a delay on processing at the border, that's what it amounts to, a non-tariff barrier. And so the programs are one thing, the infrastructure is a second piece. What I didn't tell you in my opening remarks about the city of Windsor and Detroit is that we're on the backbone of the NAFTA superhighway. And what that means is we are the busiest border crossing between the United States and Canada. So 11,000 trucks cross at the Ambassador Bridge each and every day. 1.7 billion crosses the border every single day. 25% of that 1.7 billion crosses at Windsor and Detroit. And so several years ago, it's been a decade of conversation with respect to, more than a decade of conversation with respect to building a new crossing between Windsor and Detroit. Partly for security reasons, but partly in anticipation that truck traffic will increase and we need to make sure that we can move vehicles quickly and efficiently through the border. And so the Gordie Howe Bridge has been approved. They've done lots of site prep, and they expect by June of this year to award the contract. And hopefully sometime in the fall there'll be a shovel in the ground, and we'll see this $4 billion structure rise, that again, another crossing to link Windsor and Detroit, highway to highway connections. One of the other things that we're doing is we're partnering with the city of Detroit. And so we're looking at technology to be able to move vehicles. We're looking to the future, and we're saying, what do we need to do with respect to autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles? How can we be better, and how can we take a leadership role? And why would we take a leadership role? Because we're on a border, but we also collectively, Windsor and Detroit, there's a tunnel that links downtown to downtown. We each respectively own our half of that tunnel. So we control the infrastructure. We have the ability to do things that would be difficult in any other scenario, but because of our ownership, we partnered together, and we're figuring out how an autonomous and connected vehicle will be able to navigate through a border. And it's simple things. I mean, it's one thing to be able to drive up and have an RFID that raises the toll gate and you can drive through. It's another thing to have the vehicle approach a customs booth and have the officer interact with a passenger and then communicate with the vehicle in some way to either release the vehicle or refer the vehicle. And so there were more than 100 different instances that we've identified together that we need to work on in preparation for the future to be able to move vehicles and passengers more quickly.
Great. And in a great act of diplomacy, you named the bridge after a Canadian-born hockey player who played for a U.S. team, right?
That's right.
Mr. Gordie
Red
Howe.
Wings.
We have a few minutes for questions, 5 or 6 minutes, but let's make sure that they are questions, not comments, and we'll keep it short. Mr. Shapiro there, and Mr. Erb over there. Microphones to... Oh, but they can't hear you. We're broadcasting internationally.
To the three border mayors, are the governments, are they listening in Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City?
Oh, and let's take the question from a Guy on the other side, and then these folks can respond.
Yes, Guy Erb, Berkeley Research Group. My question is similar. 24 years ago, the senior senator from California voted against the NAFTA. What are you hearing now from the congressman representing your region and from the state senators when you talk to them about the issues you talked to us about today?
There we go. I'll go through the group and you can respond to either or both of the questions, and you can also add a little soupçon of closing remark. Let's start with Don. We haven't heard from him for a while.
Well, our collaboration with all orders of government in Canada, we're really well aligned with our federal government on this, and our elected officials across all parties at all levels are aligned on this. So I'd say that the Canadian consensus is fairly strong on this. I think the American answer is probably more complex, so I'll yield the floor for the answer to that. But that's why we're here, is to connect at all levels with those decision makers. Again, working hand in glove with the embassy and our trade representatives at all levels.
Mayor Dilkin.
I would say, just to echo Don's comments, absolutely all three levels of government in Canada are doing their part, trying to get the message out. That's, again, why we're here. Are people listening? I think so. I certainly believe Canadians know that we're a trading nation. And as I said earlier, you'd be hard-pressed to go into any Tim Hortons where this wasn't the hot topic of conversation of the day, because it really holds the media headlines, and people understand the importance. People in my community understand it. People in Don's community, people across Canada understand the importance of this particular agreement. I would say that Donald Trump was right about one thing, that NAFTA needs to be updated, that we need to look at how to better move people. And we talk about simple things like computer system analyst, which is a position under NAFTA, approved again in 1994. What does that mean? What does that mean? And when I talk about non-tariff barriers, someone shows up at the border saying, I want to apply for a free trade, a NAFTA visa, as a computer system analyst. If you had 100 customs officers processing 100 different people, you may get 50 different responses, interpretations of the same resume, the same application. So it's also inconsistent application. And so the president was right to say, you know what, we need to talk about it, because we too believe that there are ways to improve NAFTA to make sure that it represents and works for the digital economy on both sides of the border. I mean, there are folks who are, you think of today versus 1994, folks who are computer either programmers, who are robot technicians, PLC programmers. They don't really fall under the computer system analyst. So they're almost completely excluded. And on a practical basis, on a day-to-day basis, when you have an integrated supply chain, what does that mean? That means that when a piece of equipment goes down in Detroit that was made by a company in Canada, and the employee who knows how to fix it can't get a free trade visa to get over there and fix it, that the line will oftentimes shut down until something can be worked out to get the person over across the border. And this works both ways, across the border, to be able to repair a piece of equipment that's critical to production. And so let's have the conversation. We're doing that. Let's figure out how we can make improvements, how we can make it work better. It's probably right to do that after 24 years. And you know, we're happy to do that. And there are changes on both sides that I think make sense.
Mayor Gastelum,
Yes,
last comment wrap up.
Thank you. Let's. Mayor Drew Dilkin says, well, that description of that post doesn't exist. That means that 1994 it might have been there, but we have to improve it. We have to modernize it. We have to review it. Yes, but not getting it out of our ways. Not saying let's substitute NAFTA for something else, or just we have to work as one big region. Not as three countries trying to work themselves apart, or not realizing that it's modernized, that it's a global thing, it's a global matter. Our government is fully in for NAFTA, but we do recognize we have to modernize it. We have to put it back to our actual dynamics, demands, and we can work on that. I'm pretty sure we're gonna get there. I'm pretty sure that's it's normal. We're humans. We're trying to look out for the best for our countries, but we cannot lose our main interest, and that's competitiveness. We have to be there. We have to work together. It's not a matter of countries. It's a matter of regions. It's a matter of working out for best results for our people, and that's our main issue. It's the people to whom we have to do our best. And I thank you again. I thank again for this opportunity to be here and talk about NAFTA. We do need it, and we're going for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Faulkner, you're wrapping up.
Well, it is rarely do I get the opportunity to sit on a panel where you have such unanimity across a topic. That's why we're here, to share our stories. And to answer your question directly, in terms of some of the policymakers here in Washington, D.C., look, we have very compelling and powerful examples of success. And that's why we are telling our story here. We're meeting with members of the House and Senate subcommittees, and we're going to continue to say, here are the facts on the ground. And yes, here are some of the changes that we would all probably support in modernizing and updating. Of course, that makes sense. But let's say very clearly in one voice from all three of our countries and our cities on how this is benefiting and how these good quality jobs have really come to fruition and how we have the opportunity to grow and expand to the next 24 years. And so that is the task for all of us, frankly, over the next several months as we're going through these negotiations from a mayor's standpoint and city standpoint, to put very concrete, specific examples of how that works. Not just, not here in Washington, D.C. I'll be traveling to Mexico City with my friend in a couple of months. Again, talking about how this collaboration and partnership works. So it's up to all of us, ladies and gentlemen, in the coming months as these negotiations and dialogue continue to tell our story, to fight for positive change. And when we do that, the glass is absolutely half full. We can achieve success. It will not be easy. But again, this is all of us working together. It's the right thing to do. And so I'm glad, again, to be here today with the Wilson Center, this opportunity. All of my colleagues and our mayors, you are going to hear not just us who are on this panel today, but we have mayors from all over the United States, all over Canada, my colleagues from Mexico. You're seeing an increase in people telling this success story. That's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it is great having the mayors in Washington this week. I think this Mayorapalooza is really shaking things up, really reminding us that all politics are local politics. So thank you, Mexico Institute and Council of the Americas, for putting this together. And please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists for talking to me today.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
We're going to move directly into our next panel, so hang tight, everyone, and could the panelists please come up on stage? We'll get the name tents and things set up right now.
That water wasn't touched.
If I'd gotten down to Tijuana, I could have put my hand up. Yes. That's the only thing I got to do now, but we'll come visit again.
Please, if you do, give us a holler. Hey, come down if you want to. Have us, we'll pick you up at the border. Yes.
Bueno.
I mean,
Yeah, we'll swap.
yes.
Well, and if you guys want to both come and present in Ottawa, too.
Oh, you need to drink water. I didn't touch it.
Invite us.
Yeah?
It's a little warm, but
Why don't we do that?
I'll follow Kevin.
Okay.
Dawson, thank you very much.
oh, thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And then what's the other one? I'm sorry. Yardstick.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yardstick. Chris is a good friend of mine, actually. One of my first campaign supporters.
Oh, is
So-
that right?
Yeah. No, we've got some very, very cool tech happening.
All right.
Attached to the Computer Science School at the
Oh,
U of
for
A.
sure. My husband works with them.
Oh, right on.
Yeah. And he said it's been
So
once a month.
we're all integrated. Then,
We
right?
are all integrated.
That's
So,
your personal NAFTA story.
Yeah,
Does he have
exactly.
an easy time at the border or a hard time at the border?
you know what? A difficult time if he flies into Calgary.
No problems in
Goes-
Edmonton?
No problems. Calgary is ridiculous. He's been slagged now, and he goes to the airport, and he's stuck there for interrogation. So he now avoids that completely.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you. Hi.
How are you? Absolutely. It's good.
Looking forward to. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I last minute sent Chris. Very well. Here.
Yeah, you were here yesterday. You and me both.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. They covered a lot of the same
Yes, indeed.
stuff, but it's good because they laid that groundwork and we can continue it.
Now we've got to sort of follow it as it flows through the regulatory process here in IRS.
Perfect. We will do it. We will do it.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks, Villain. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's continue with what's already proven to be a very successful program, and now we have the opportunity to explore some of the issues that we just looked at from a local political level. We have the opportunity to look at from a more business perspective, and it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome both Karan Bhatia and also Paula Avila to a panel discussion that, as I mentioned, is going to focus more on the business aspect of NAFTA. You have their biographic information available to you, so I'm not going to go into that other than to say both of them are actual experts in the field, and so this is actually a very atypical Washington panel because the panelists know what they're talking about, so we're going to have some fun today. But it is a pleasure to welcome both of you, so let's jump right into it. Karan, I want to start with you and then come to Paula. You know, NAFTA is frequently discussed at the macro level, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's good for this country or that country, or, you know, hollowed out this or added jobs there. It's oftentimes not discussed at the micro level in terms of how the firm does business. And I wonder if you could kind of walk us through how business is done today in North America and why that matters from a NAFTA perspective. I mean, how are the two even linked? Give us a sense of how a business person looks at these.
So, Eric, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Look, I think what would surprise people, probably at least with respect to how GE, my company, sort of operates in the transborder environment, is how thoroughly integrated not just the production processes are, but in fact sort of innovation processes across the border. So I will, you know, we can take any of our businesses, GE, multi-pronged, but a full scope of infrastructure kinds of businesses. So, you know, take aviation as an example. So we manufacture some of the world's leading jet engines around the world. So not only is the manufacturing process pulling pieces from across the border where we manufacture flanges, for instance, in our state-of-the-art facility in Bromont in Quebec, but they get married to innovation that is happening at our innovation center, 2,000 strong, terrific, fabulous engineers in Querétaro, Mexico, coming back to be assembled in Cincinnati or Lynn, Massachusetts, and then ultimately exported around the world. So one point would be this is a cycle not just of products flowing across borders, but of innovation flowing across borders, ultimately creating products that we think are far more competitive for global markets than they would otherwise be. I think the second thing to point out about this, and we may get into this more, but it's not only that we look at Canada and Mexico as key sources of inputs into our global product line. And by the way, I gave you the example of aviation. We could talk healthcare, we could talk rail, but it's also, those markets have become increasingly important markets unto themselves for us. So we export about $2 billion a year, sell ultimately $2 billion a year in Canada, $2 billion a year in Mexico. These are not the small de minimis markets that I think they're sometimes portrayed as being. These are significant markets unto themselves for high technology products. Our partners in these countries are terrific partners who we work on projects with not only in Canada and Mexico, but globally as well. So it's really a very seamless kind of interaction that reflects, I think, the fact that we look at Canada and Mexico really without borders to some extent as being part of our home base. And we're in a world where we're competing around the world with many other companies from countries that have significantly expanded home bases themselves, trading blocks as it were. And that's the reason why NAFTA and Canada and Mexico are so critical to us.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the model today looks nothing like, if it ever did exist, the stereotypical model that many people would say it's, you know, created and designed in the U.S. and then people produce in Mexico because of low wages, environmental lax regulations, et cetera. You're telling me that's not the way it is anymore? Who knew?
Again, you know, think about if I would invite you all at some point to come to our innovation center in Querétaro. I mean, it is state of the art. It's the equivalent of what you would find in Silicon Valley or at our research centers in upstate New York. And the reason we do it is because there's tremendous expertise in aviation engineering in Querétaro, and that's why we export around the world. The same is true in the high-tech manufacturing processes that we undertake in Bromont. Now, it's not to say that we don't do terrific engineering in the United States. We do. We do terrific manufacturing here as well. But we're just so much better off when we're able to pull all of those different skill sets together and be able to marry them in products that ultimately allow us to be cost competitive around the world.
And Paula, from the Board of Trade Alliance perspective, I'm going to ask you broadly the same question. How is business done today? Or let me ask it slightly differently. Karan, I think, gave us a terrific overview from the GE perspective. Tell us something we might not know about how business is done. You know, from the Washington perspective, we all think we know everything, right? But we obviously don't. Give us a sense of what we might not know and why that's important from the NAFTA perspective.
Sure, and I think that's a very important question because you have to really understand what the terminology means when we talk about producing a product. What does that mean? And manufacturing. And if it's just to break it down, if you're manufacturing, say, in Mexico, that doesn't just mean producing this product, you know, there. What goes into actually the production is the engineering, the design, initially, the tools that it will take to produce that item, the machinery and the tools, and then needless to say, the production that goes into producing those tools and those machines, and then the assembly. So it's very generalized when we talk about manufacturing that's done in Mexico, when in reality, the United States, one of our largest exports are machinery. We're producing the machinery that is then exported into Mexico and used at these plants to assemble and you know, do some of that production within that supply chain. So the supply chain really should be broken down in, you know, into these very small, you know, like focus areas to understand that when you break it down, each part of it is integrated between these three countries. So there isn't any part of it that is done unilaterally. You know, an American-made product is not an American-made product. It's actually, you know, a North American product. And conversely, when we import a Canadian product or a Mexican product, it was U.S. made as well. As we know, 40% U.S. content of every Mexican import. What does that mean? You have to understand that, you know, if I'm producing a product, or if a product's being produced and I designed it, or I'm doing the marketing for it, I take ownership of that too. I'm part of that production chain.
I'm glad you mentioned the statistic 40%. That's from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the equivalent for Canada is 25%, which is still quite high, not quite as high as Mexico, which is 40, but the equivalent, Karan, and you guys do a huge amount of business elsewhere in the world, but the equivalent with China is 4%, so 10 times higher for Mexico than China in terms of U.S. content. So, Paul, I think that goes directly to the point you're making about as production increases in Mexico, that actually draws in production from the United States and Canada as well, so we're growing together. Let me pursue that a little bit from the other perspective then. This is kind of how the world has developed under NAFTA. The theme of today's program is a world without NAFTA.
Yeah.
So can you give us a sense, Karan, and then Paula, I'll come back to you as well. You know, if NAFTA went away
Sure.
or was substantially altered and reduced in effectiveness, what would that actually mean?
Yeah.
Because, you know, we talk about this in the abstract,
Yeah.
but people's lives are impacted. How? What would it mean for business?
I think, first of all, just to underscore a point you made, if it went away in ways that were, or if it was altered in ways that were unproductive, because at the end of the day, we support a updated, strengthened NAFTA. We you know, it is a 25-year plus old agreement. There are certainly things we can. I know we're going to probably get to that, but look, if NAFTA disappeared tomorrow without anything to replace it, I think you'd have a whole variety of unfortunate consequences, to be honest with you. I think, you know, the first is, as I mentioned before, we'd likely lose the position that we currently enjoy in Canada and Mexico as end markets unto themselves. You know, a particularly important set of provisions for us is around government procurement, and come to that, but we sell heavily to governments or state-owned, state-related entities. So I think that would be one concern for us, and probably for a number of other American companies in industries that are similarly situated. Secondly, we would become less productive around the world. I mean, that's just simply, the case. We would the level, I think, of uncertainty that would automatically creep into our production relationships, our trade relationships, the ability to move things across border. I mean, I should make clear that, and this, to some extent this ties into the first point more than the second, but the tariffs themselves are not probably deal killers for us, right? I mean, MFN tariffs either in Mexico and Canada or in the United States are not unto themselves problematic, but the uncertainty, I think, that would be engendered in the overall trade relationship, the consequences, the political and other consequences that would come from simply the fracturing of this agreement, I think would be very, I think it would ill-serve, American companies that look to the stability of the Mexico-Canada-U.S. relationship to create the platform to thereby be able to export globally. So, I think we'd be less competitive in global markets. And then finally, I think there's just the broader question from a trade policy, foreign policy, and other perspective of what sort of signals would this send to our trading partners around the world. As it is, I will tell you that our competitors from other countries, other regions, are not hesitating to underscore to customers in Mexico and Canada that they may not be able to rely on the stability of the U.S. relationships there, and American companies sort of being glommed in with that. And we certainly resist that. We point out how strong our presence is, how strong our commitment is. We have terrific workforces in both Canada and Mexico, and we do everything we can to reassure them that we intend to keep that. But nonetheless, there's some level of uncertainty that creeps into those relationships, the customer relationships, the employee relationships, and then ultimately affecting our international presence.
Well, that's really turned the model on its head, hasn't it? Because traditionally, a comparative advantage of U.S. business has been certainty and the reliability, not just of the product, but of everything that comes behind it.
Yep.
And I think the point that you just raised, Karan, I think is absolutely fundamental, and I'm glad that you did. I wasn't going to ask that question, but I'm glad that you went that direction, so thank you for that. And Paula, because of that, I'm going to shift a little bit in terms of the question to you. But, one of the things that when you talk to the negotiators and you say, well, there will be disruptions in the supply chain, right, if the NAFTA goes away or if there's a substantially altered in some way, and they say, yes, that's true, but your business, you'll adjust, and basically that's okay, right? Now, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth, but simply to say, business is resilient. Business will adjust. You guys have been living well for 25 years. Now's your time to kind of take one for the team, right? From your perspective and the border area, is that realistic? Will businesses adjust? And if so, under what time frame, what cost? How significant are we talking here? Or is this something that's flip the switch and, okay, well, we'll get a supply, we'll change our supply routes and our labor force, and that's okay because we're anticipating that anyway. Give us a sense of how your constituencies are looking at that.
Well, I think initially they will adjust by, it's a tremendous increase in costs, which means it's going to completely obliterate any gains that they might have had with the tax reform. So as you're talking about the administration implementing things that, it's okay if you adjust, but we want to help you save money. But then on this other hand, we understand that this is going to increase costs. Their way of adjustment, though, is what we've heard from many of our members' businesses. It's not going to change their decisions in terms of moving manufacturing back to the U.S. So it's not going to adjust in that way. The way it's going to adjust is with prices that then are passed down to the consumers. And the consumers are several. They are the suppliers that then, an automotive company, their suppliers are impacted as well, and then the end consumer. And then again, the tax reform, any benefits that the tax reform might have had on your paycheck, you are now going to see that, and it's going to be completely wiped out when you go to the store, and your products are going to cost a lot more. So I think that the reality, the outcome is pretty severe. And a new study just showed that in the first year after if NAFTA is canceled, we would see $1.8 million fewer jobs. To put that into terms, I don't know if, when you get into the millions, it's hard to understand what that means. So in relative terms, on our best year, we could have it, recently we had a 2 million increase in jobs or job creation in this country. So you're going to wipe out economic growth. Nationwide. You wipe out economic growth. Then you go into stagnation. And then you go into year 2, because that's just year 1. So then you go into a recession because you are now stagnating the economy, overall. That's pretty severe. When you're talking, especially when the administration is planning for a 3% growth, economic growth.
And we're talking right now primarily about the United States, but remember, there are 3 parties in this agreement.
And these 3 parties are our neighbors.
Right.
So which economies do we want to flourish? Right. We want our closest neighbors to have growth in their economies. And that then goes into a whole array of other issues that you're trying to accomplish and reduce the flow of illegal immigration. One way to do that is to increase the economies of your neighbors. And so if you're going to be adversely impacting not just yours but surrounding countries, your closest neighbors, that's going to have then a rippling effect again on your economy. It's not just the supply chains that are integrated, it's our economies that are integrated, these 3. When one catches a cold, the other one will have a fever.
I think the Mexico Institute here has actually done some really good work in terms of migratory flows, particularly Mexico and the United States has found that they're net zero, essentially. But one wonders if without NAFTA, that throws Mexico potentially into recession. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, when Mexico's economy is challenged, we see greater flows into the United States for economic opportunity. And so, again, there are some broader repercussions here that would love to explore. We don't have time on a business panel, but I think these are absolute, these are issues, right? Yep. And we can talk about this in the abstract, but again, people's lives are being changed by this. So let me change the focus just a little bit, and then we'll have the opportunity to go to you for your questions as well. All right, so we've talked about what happens if it went away and what would it mean to business and these sorts of things. But if you had a magic wand, how would you change NAFTA, right? We all talk about, well, let's update it and make it better, right? That's easy for me to say. Yeah. What does that mean? You've already mentioned government procurement, but give us a sense, Karan, of how you were a former deputy U.S. trade negotiator, representative and top negotiator. You know this world. How would you make it better? And then I'm going to ask the same question to Paula based on your constituencies.
Well, first of all, let me reiterate what I was saying before. It absolutely can be made better.
Yes.
And no knock on NAFTA or the NAFTA negotiators to begin with, but things have evolved in 25 years. Industries have evolved, technologies have evolved, and frankly, trade policy has evolved. So, I think there's some terrific model provisions and agreements that have evolved over the years that can be incorporated. And I know that the team at USTR and in Canada and Mexico are certainly taking a look at that. Obviously, they're in the context of TPP. There was a lot of thought given to different provisions. From our vantage point, with just a GE hat on at the moment, I think I'd flag 2 things in particular. First of all, energy. We are, transparently self-interested in this space because we're a big both supplier of energy-related equipment, oil and gas-related equipment, and also very heavily in the power generation, transmission, and distribution space. But the reality of it is that this sector, which, although there is chapter, there are large exclusions in the current NAFTA, could be dramatically updated. I mean, the vision fundamentally that I think those of us who work in this space would be of a truly integrated market, both for molecules, as they say, and electrons, so both the product and for electricity flowing across borders. And that vision, frankly, could be not only an enormous growth opportunity for all 3 countries just within that space, but would be incredibly empowering, I think, of a energized manufacturing presence in the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So if you want to talk about key drivers of manufacturing competitiveness, energy prices are item number 1, I think, around the world. So I think there is a lot that can be done in this space. I give the Mexican government credit in recent years for having done some impressive things in opening up that industry and the industries, those sectors. But that we keep our fingers crossed that that remains the case. But NAFTA, by locking in some of those reforms, by creating a basis for being assured that that's going to be the future, is going to incentivize the kinds of investments in Mexico and, frankly, in the United States and Canada that are going to help ensure that we are able to capture the benefits of it going forward. So I'd say that's number one. Number two is one that you hear a lot about. You may be a little surprised hearing about it from GE. We don't think, you may not think of us in this space, but digital-related issues. And here, we are, GE is one of the largest, actually, suppliers and managers of software and of digital products around the world. They're not the kinds of things that you may use on your laptop, but they are very much embedded into hardware, the equipment, the industrial internet, as we call it, of data flowing off of machines, whether it's jet engines, gas turbines, and so forth. Now, from our perspective, this is a critical part of the service that we now provide together with the hardware to create efficiencies for our customers around the world. We see the greatest threat. Now, the technology is there. We are deeply invested in it, and our customers in Mexico and Canada and, frankly, the rest of the world are really excited to capture those efficiencies. The great looming potential threat out there is the growth of data protectionism, whether it's in North America or elsewhere. I'm not flagging Canada and Mexico as being particularly problematic in this sense, but here's a chance to put in place a set of rules that are going to be, frankly, the template for the rest of the world going forward. So that's the second area that I'd flag as being an area that we'd love to see 21st century rules adopted in. And we're hopefully optimistic on both of these fronts that the Trump administration, together with their counterparts in Canada and Mexico, are going to reach a happy ending on this.
And again, this is just not the storyline that's traditionally told about NAFTA, is it? I mean, digital, industrial internet, energy integration, this is just not the NAFTA story. And I guess my contention, I'm stepping out of the moderator role now and just talking from my account, basically, but people don't know what NAFTA really is today. I mean, maybe in 1994, but that was 25 years ago. And we're dealing, in some cases, with the same talking points, in some cases with the same people, literally saying those same talking points. And the information just hasn't been updated, and so I'm just really delighted by the ground truth in that we have right now in some of these things. And so, Paula, I'm going to ask you the same question about how would you update, improve NAFTA, just a clear shot. You can wave your magic wand and you can improve it. How would you do it?
Well, speaking from a border region, San Diego, Tijuana, and then the Border Trade Alliance, Karan mentioned this. It's not just tariffs that are trade barriers. It's physical barriers. And we have the busiest land border crossing in San Diego, Tijuana. Across the border, we have tremendous border delays. How do you improve efficiencies? You can do it through a modernized NAFTA, which will, again, have tremendous benefits to the economy. So implementing the North American single window proposal, unified cargo processing, which is a pilot program right now. It needs to be made permanent. That's where you have joint inspection facilities side by side. You don't unload cargo multiple times, and on both sides of the border, you're doing it once. That tremendously improves efficiencies, reduces the costs. Also, improved cross-border interagency collaboration and the collaboration of designing and building our ports of entry. We have not invested in the infrastructure to account for the increase in trade. NAFTA 2.0 can do that. It can have a commitment trilaterally for the investment, the design, the collaboration for the future ports of entry that use technology, everything that you mentioned, have broadband internet access across the border, which is critical for the actual customs process. And a lot of these very real barriers that have just grown because of the increase of trade. And then I'll mention one more, which is NADBank, modernizing the North American Development Bank. It's a great opportunity to do that in this renegotiation, to broaden NADBank's role and have them play the role of financing border infrastructure projects, increasing their capital, and their role. I think that could be tremendous. We need a vehicle like that has that trilateral authority to move forward.
And can help on some of those border issues, right? For those who may not know, it's the North American Development Bank, but obviously this is a sophisticated audience, so everybody knew that. You know, the irony of this is as the trade flows have increased year on year, with a dip immediately after 9/11, but broadly speaking, year-on-year increases in trade, not just from Mexico and the United States, but also Canada. The infrastructure at the border has simply not kept up, as you've said. And so you've created these choke points that instead of, in the business world, what we would do is we would try to eliminate those choke points.
Right.
We would try to increase throughput. And yet, because of the way the global circumstances have gone, and we all understand that, this is not anything but a statement of fact, the borders have gotten, as the Canadians like to say, thicker and more complicated and more difficult, even as those trade flows are increasing. So there's just a fundamental mismatch there. So then infrastructure, which you just brought up, Paolo, is absolutely right, and thank you for raising that. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that when folks like Arturo Saracán and Tony Wayne and some of the others join us in the panel next time, because that's a lot of the work that they did when they were ambassadors as well. We have, as I promised, the opportunity to go to some of you. We have about 10 minutes, and we have 2 questions right there. Let's take them together, and maybe we can fit in a third there. But let's start with these two. If you could identify yourself by name and organization you may be representing.
Yeah, I'm Justin Margolis with the government of Quebec. And just a question from the business community. There's been much legal question of the authority of the president to withdraw a loan without Congress. And if he were to invoke Article 2205 without consulting Congress and withdraw, you could easily see legal action from the Congress, from governors, from mayors. But what about the business community? Does the business community think that they would have legal standing to bring action against the president for a withdrawal? You've been financially damaged, possibly. And is there any talk about that?
All right, interesting question. And right behind you, I believe there was a question as well.
Hi, yes, Catalina, a student at Georgetown University. I wanted to ask, there's some talk about how the president's way of handling business and how he would say that he's getting out of NAFTA, not really doing it, but just as a way to like go on forward and push further the Canadians and the Mexicans to agree with whatever the U.S. is asking for. So as a strategy more than anything else. I wanted to know how would this affect business? Whether it goes away and then he stops saying that he's going to get out of NAFTA, et cetera, but how does this affect business, say?
And I think let's take that third question right there, and then we'll ask you to respond in order.
Thank you. Herbert Francisco Curriarceo. I'm here as a citizen from Mexico. I'd like to know what the firm perspective is on converting a trilateral agreement to bilateral agreements. Is this something that the private sector has considered, and what the ramifications of that might be? Thank you.
So these are all questions that are out there, aren't they? None of us here speak for any administration, of course, but Karan, I wonder if you'd like to take a stab at least a couple of those. Give us your sense.
Sure,
how you might be seeing it. Yeah,
I'm happy to. I don't have any. I haven't got any thoughts on the first question. I'm sorry, I really don't. I haven't. I think we are, and I'm speaking quite frankly. I think the business community and certainly my company is still hopeful, genuinely hopeful that this is going to, that this negotiation is ultimately going to be successful, that we're going to end up in a better, more modernized regime than before, and the notion of suing any of the governments here is honestly not one that has crossed my mind up to this point in time. So take that for what it's worth. The next one, the question about some of the president's statements as negotiating tactics and so forth. I can give you a little bit of a business perspective and then put my former USTR hat on it a little bit. So look, from a business perspective, I think there is a growing sort of sense that this is a negotiation, guys, and there's toing and froing, and things may be asked for that seem a little out there, but at the end of the day, there's a sense and frankly, I think it's informed as much by the outcomes that we're seeing in other spaces, the non-trade space. So the fact that tax reform in the United States got across the finish line, I think, was extremely reassuring to the broader business community. Was it everything everybody wanted? Absolutely not. But at the end of the day, it was a workable solution that we think is going to move things forward in the right direction. Regulatory reform in other spaces has, I think, been in general a huge shot in the arm for business in the United States. So if you pulse most CEOs today, there's a general sense of optimism about the direction that the economy is on and the country is on. Now, trade is a little unnerving. The rhetoric is unnerving, and the threat that you might, possibly not have a NAFTA is certainly unnerving. But I think it's allayed to some extent by the sense that, in general, things are going in the right direction. We seem to be landing, whether it's, through careful design or through happenstance, but landing in some good places. So I'd put that from the business perspective. From the trade negotiators hat on, look, I used to negotiate. I was in the Bush administration, and I said I both had the best situation and the absolute worst situation. I was working for President Bush, who was an avowed free trader. He would, was completely bought into the notion, diehard committed to NAFTA and so forth. He was absolutely the most toothless tiger ever when it came to, sitting down and threatening your opponent with, you don't know what the president's going to do. You don't know what the president's, because you knew what the president was going to do. He wanted to do the trade deal. So I actually think that, look, trade negotiating is its own, sport, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of positioning that goes on in the course of it. And I think, frankly, my hope is at the end of the day, we're going to end up in a better place than we are right now. And the president, it may very well be, lending some rhetoric to help support his negotiators. Pure speculation.
And it does seem as if I can project a little bit, the Canadian and Mexican counterparts have seen that somewhat. No, I mean, from my perspective, there's been a huge amount of restraint, actually, trying to keep the process going, trying to find solutions, trying to accommodate political interests in all three capitals. Yep. Would you agree with that or no, based on your experience as a trade negotiator?
Look, I think you've got them all sort of circling around. Yeah. I mean, I think that we're in that phase of these negotiations. I think there is also a sense of time pressure here that I'll tell you, I did the Korea negotiation. We went, whatever it was, 14 rounds. I mean, we're going into round 6 here. This is still early days, is my sense. I may be completely wrong, but I sense that we've got a ways to play out. So I think everybody take a deep breath. We're continuing to invest in Mexico and Canada. We're continuing to do business across the border, continuing to buy, sell, engage. We're going to keep pushing forward until we see things take a dramatically different turn.
Karan didn't know I was going to pitch him that question, so thank you for responding to it. Paula, so, the question about bilaterals, and you're the Border Trade Alliance, that's the U.S.-Mexico border. Let me ask you a leading question. Would it be that big of a deal or that tragic to your members if NAFTA went away and was replaced by some sort of a U.S.-Mexico bilateral? Tell us why or why not.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, he just mentioned how long it takes to reach a bilateral agreement. What I foresee happening is we're going to be doing bilateral agreements industry by industry. Do you know how long that's going to take? And at the same time, trade is occurring without us. TPP's being signed, and that has Canada, Mexico, Japan. Canada and Mexico will continue, and they will now have a stronger relationship, a trading partnership with Asia. For our friends watching from Asia, I mean, that's tremendous opportunities for Canada and Mexico. We already had an agreement with Canada before NAFTA. That's ancient. I'm not sure that that is viable to return to. So, I mean, I think it would be devastating because of the time that it will take to then catch up to all the other global competitors the competitors that we're competing with globally. It puts our businesses at a disadvantage, and businesses then you will see expanding. I agree. You will still invest in Mexico and Canada, and they will keep those operations, but they will now be expanding offshore, which is to a detriment to the U.S.
The country or the dog that hasn't barked yet in this conversation that nobody's mentioned is China, right? And, you're talking about alternatives and new supply chains, and we've mentioned TPP in Japan. What are you seeing, just from an observational perspective, Paula, in the border areas that you're familiar with, or other areas for that matter, in terms of China, or less about China and more about Mexico's desire and willingness to find new partners in an era of uncertainty. Is that a fair way to put it? Is that something you're seeing, or am I overstating the case?
No, so, you know, our relationship, U.S.-Mexico relationship, is critical in our region, but it's an international presence that we have. You have German companies, you have Asian companies, a tremendous amount of companies from China, Canada in Tijuana, right on the border. So it already has a huge international presence. Why? Because we're in a global economy. That is what trade is today. You don't just stay in your country. As we're talking about trade, it's foreign direct investment and what that spurs. We have a huge presence of foreign companies in the U.S., right, because of trade. So you already have that happening, and that has been fostered by NAFTA. So without that, I think that then it opens up a great opportunity for China to increase their presence in Mexico, especially in the automotive industry, and with Japan. I think that's, you know, it will strengthen every other economic power outside of us.
A little bit of self-criticism here as we close this panel. We've had a terrific conversation. We, meaning me, probably should have done more to bring somebody who could talk about the U.S.-Canada border in greater depth, but everybody enjoys January in Canada so much that it was difficult to get people to come down for that part of the conversation. But nonetheless, do not assume that we are only focused on Mexico in the NAFTA context. This is a trilateral agreement, and I have never ceased to be amazed at the number of times people don't actually know the countries that are in the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the number of times people think, for example, that China is part of NAFTA or other countries. Right. And so
I do want to say the Border Trade Alliance does have Canadian membership,
so
so we do care very much about the relationship.
Fair enough, but I directed the conversation on the U.S.-Mexico border, which, as I say, was self-criticism. So in any event, a terrific conversation. Wish that we had more time with both of you. Regrettably, we don't, because we have the ambassadors panel that follows, and that's going to be equally impressive. And I would ask all of you to please join me in thanking our two panelists for the terrific conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you. I'm in San Diego.
In San Diego?
Kind of virtual because
We'll continue to just plow straight ahead and move into our final panel. So I invite our panelists, our three ambassadors. Actually, unfortunately, Ambassador Blanchard had an emergency come up and isn't able to join us today, but we still have a fantastic panel. Three ambassadors, one from each country of the NAFTA region.
Any seating arrangements you're suggesting?
You guys can find it out. Except we'll change your names. Do you have a name tag? Oh, they're right down there, I guess.
Service?
Yeah.
22 years.
Okay, so we make it over 100.
Only is it because of you the room is empty?
No, I think it's because people had to go to the bathroom.
So how are you keeping?
Good. You?
Very well, thanks. Just fine. I was in Guadalajara a few weeks ago and got into a great discussion down there. It was a big business guy saying that in English we have a North American Free Trade Agreement. He's swapping down that in Spanish. Actually, it's a treaty. I don't think it is a treaty.
For Mexico, it's a treaty.
Okay.
And the Senate has to ratify it. It has. Oh, yeah.
I didn't appreciate that. Okay. There's something.
Okay, thanks to all of you who are still here. And we appreciate the two panels before us. Had a lot of good things to say, but I was just totaling up the year, so we have about 100 years of diplomatic experience here. and a lot of it on
Most of it on that end of the table.
50 years over there by Arturo. No, but very happy to have Michael Kurgan, a very distinguished Canadian diplomat, ambassadorial experience, but a lot of experience working on North America. And Arturo Saracán, also former ambassador, and spent a lot of time in the United States working on this relationship. And I had the privilege to work a little bit on both Mexico and Canada, as well as economic affairs during my time in my career. I wanted to start off just a little bit, since we had a mention of talking about some of the recent studies. And if you look behind, you can see, I have 3 slides here. There have been a number of very good studies on the effect of ending NAFTA. And so this first one on jobs shows a range of short-term job losses in the U.S. of 180,000 to 1.8 million. In Canada, 125,000 to 1.2 million. Mexico, 1 to 10 million possible job losses if NAFTA were to go away. Okay, then if we, there's jobs, GDP decline. Again, the effect of NAFTA leaving 0.6% in the United States, which is $120 billion, up to 1.2% of GDP, $231 billion. In Mexico, about 1.48% of GDP. In Canada, 1.81% of GDP. Long-term effect in the U.S. estimated at $36 to $99 billion a year, 0.2 to 0.5% of GDP. And then if we look at the shrinking trade, you can see similarly some big losses on an annual basis, a number of which would continue into the long term, and not only trade between the 3 countries, but exports to other countries. And this last study sponsored by the Business Roundtable also finds that the biggest winners if NAFTA ends internationally are China, Korea, Japan, and Germany. Not surprising, the other big export markets. And they would have a significant positive impact in their economies. So just to start off then, I'd like to ask my colleagues, talk a little bit about what's been built over the past 20 plus years now with NAFTA. You know, the doors were opened economically, but for other cooperation, of course, across North America. Michael, you want to start off?
Well, from the Canadian perspective, we started with a pretty integrated system in the auto manufacturing. Tony, as you know, we had the Auto Pact agreement that was struck in the 1960s, 70s, and then we had our building on that, a free trade agreement with the United States, which was then concluded just about 1984, and then NAFTA came along, which essentially built a lot on the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, but adding Mexico and then updating that in the 3 or 4 years between the conclusion of the 2 agreements. So we actually were in a reasonably good economic integrated state with the United States before NAFTA. And what NAFTA did for us was to build further and involve, and that was the most important part, is including Mexico in our economic sort of diaspora, if you will. Mm-hmm. From the supply chain, which was then the auto manufacturing moved to the south, and we became much more integrated in manufacturing by investing fairly heavily in Mexico. Our trade with Mexico increased about 8 times over the course of NAFTA. So I would say that, interestingly enough, the largest impact that NAFTA did for us, beyond sort of the integrated supply chains, which were kind of developing there anyway, and would have, I think, without NAFTA probably, essentially was with our trade with Mexico and building that base with Mexico, which I think will go forward, and we can get onto that a little bit post-NAFTA, will probably go forward and be increased and more intensified if we come to a situation where NAFTA no longer exists. So I would say we can talk about the problems that if NAFTA is terminated, it would be huge, but I wouldn't argue too strongly that NAFTA changed our economic relationship with the United States remarkably. It just increased it, enhanced it.
Thank you. Arturo.
Thank you, Tony, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to being here with two colleagues, one of whom I worked with in the last years of my tenure as ambassador. Tony and I think did very good stuff together. People tend to forget that an ambassador is as effective and as successful as his counterpart in the other capital, because when you work in tandem and you become co-conspirators, and sometimes, you play the good cop to the bad cop and vice versa, that really has sort of helps to mobilize bureaucracies. And with Michael, we've had the opportunity in the past, both in the context of summits of the Americas and North American leadership summits, to talk about this 21st century vision for what North America can do on the global stage. So it's a great pleasure. As most things, and it's true, even if there are a lot of commonalities in North America, one size does not fit all in North America. And what Michael has just described as to the originating dynamics of the Canadian-U.S. relationship is quite different for Mexico. And I do believe that history allows us to see patterns and make judgments. And if you look at the history of the last 30, 40 years of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda and the diplomatic relationship, there's a pretty compelling story there. People tend to forget that in the course of 20-plus years, the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship was transformed dramatically. First because of NAFTA in 1993, and then because of something that very few people sort of tend to think about, but 9/11 and the terrorist attacks. And what this did to the way Mexico and the United States understood the dynamics that play a very important role in the task of joint security in the North American sphere. What is very stunning is not what has happened in those 20-plus years and how the Mexico-U.S. relationship morphed dramatically. This doesn't mean that it's all been peachy and rosy since then. We've had some tough and difficult moments, and there have been disagreements with both our North American partners. But if you look at the last 20 years, it's an amazing story of success. Why? Because it also comes off what had been the nadir of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship a few years before NAFTA was crafted, which was the 1980s. And people tend to forget that in the middle of the 1980s, Mexico and the United States were at each other's throats over something that had nothing to do with the U.S.-Mexico agenda, which was called Central America. The Reagan administration's view of what was happening in Central America and two successive Mexican governments' views of what was happening in Central America clashed, and to the point where the then Foreign Minister of Mexico and the then Secretary of State of the United States today would not be on a panel like this talking about what was happening in the 80s, because it was a very, very complex moment in the foreign policies of both countries as it relates to how we understood basic fundamental challenges to governance and security in a very important part of the Americas, which is Central America. But then, in the midst of that, something else happened. A story that all of you know very well in this room. A DA agent was abducted, tortured, and murdered in Mexico in 1985, in the middle of this huge geopolitical dispute over Central America. And the relationship tanked. It nosedived. And everything in the relationship got contaminated by this issue related to the murder of a DA agent on Mexican soil. A few years after, we were negotiating a free trade agreement. So I'm taking you back in time so that you understand how dramatically these relationships between both countries, Mexico and the United States in particular, have changed because of what NAFTA triggered, and then because of how 9/11 and post-9/11 security played a role in changing the mindset of the day-to-day workings of the Mexican and U.S. governments. So I start here because, yes, and you've heard about this in the previous panels, and literature has been coming out of the wazoo this year over the economic and trade impact and dislocation impacts of withdrawing from NAFTA. And the numbers are very compelling. They're real. We have a little problem, which is that people tend to forget that the U.S. presidential election in the United States was not won based on hard data and facts. It was won because of narrative and storytelling. And one of the issues that we have faced as we defend NAFTA is how do we turn all of that into storytelling and narrative that can help us make the case as to why what the U.S. has gone into could potentially disrupt the economic competitiveness and well-being of the three North American countries. But beyond the numbers, there's an even more compelling story of how NAFTA has been a geopolitical game changer in the Americas for these three countries, and we can talk about that. I guess you're going to head in that direction at some point, so I'll stop here for now.
Well, let's continue a little bit about post 9/11 and the borders, because on both borders, we have taken important steps to deepen cooperation. We have a long alliance relationship with Canada, but today we're doing many more things than we used to do bilaterally on border security, on the notion of expanding borders further away than just the physical border. Michael, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
I think that's important. It's interesting. I would argue that 9/11 actually had a greater impact on the Canada-U.S. relationship, and you can almost parallel it. If we end NAFTA, it would be as dramatic in terms of the Canada-U.S. relationship in the consequences of the dynamics of the relationship. Before 9/11, Canadian territory was seen as an asset. Why? Because it was a huge territory over which Soviet cruise missiles and missiles had to go. And so Canada was seen as a real asset. That 5,000-mile border was an asset. And we could go across the border. I went across as a young man to Buffalo because the drinking age was 18 or 21. And now it's been reversed, by the way. In Canada, it's 18, in the United States, 21. But it's still tougher to get across a border, as one of our mayors indicated. So that really did change the dynamic. And you had a closing of the border on 9/11, Alert 1 status, and nothing moved across the border. And from that, we had to build a whole new kind of architecture, institutional framework to start moving back and forth both our goods and our people. And in some ways, if NAFTA implodes or is terminated, I suspect we're going to have to use the same kind of ingenuity that we used in order to survive 9/11, to bring the border up to where we are now, which is a border, if you consider where we were in 2001 and where we are now, with the pre-clearance, with the infrastructure we've developed, with the security cooperation amongst the three countries, we've moved tremendously. And I think we are now in a situation where we can probably say we've got a fairly secure North America on the perimeter, which is quite a difference. The thing is that when 9/11 happened, security trumped trade. And we had to try and rebuild the border and the security relationships in order to make that trade happen. I'm kind of worried that if we lose NAFTA, we're going to have to start from scratch to bring a lot of this stuff back. At the same time, NAFTA has not always been exactly a free trade agreement, because in Canada we've had some huge problems, issues that have been taken out of NAFTA, like softwood lumber. The Bombardier case is a bad one, where we got a 300% tariff against Bombardier. We've had enormous problems trying to get our oil through Keystone and so on. So NAFTA hasn't been the complete sort of panacea to our economic relationship with the United States. We've had to survive despite those.
Mm-hmm.
NAFTA implodes, we're going to have to be we can talk a bit later on what I would consider would be good policy responses that we're starting to think about in Canada if NAFTA is terminated. But to make the point once more that 9/11, its impact was enormous. I think also if we terminate NAFTA, it'll be an equally complete rejuvenation or reshuffling of how Canada and the United States do business together. It'll be important.
And to Michael's point, there are, please don't think that I'm trivializing their importance or relevance by framing them this way, but there are highbrow and lowbrow security impacts of terminating NAFTA. Highbrow means you've got the larger geostrategic framework of what it means, and given that you have a president obsessed with China, what does NAFTA do or doesn't do for the ability of North America and the United States to continue to be competitive vis-a-vis China. But you've got lowbrow issues, and we've been talking about them in the first two panels, which is all of, and this is what Michael was referring to, all of the protocols and processes that aren't necessarily part of the NAFTA negotiation, but were driven because of this explosive growth in trade, which are how we do pre-clearance and how we do customs facilitate, the meat and potatoes of day-to-day trade facilitation on our border, which has been such a complex but such an important issue. The fact that Mexico today, after the Camarena incident, has armed customs officials on Mexican soil. Remember, for decades, Mexico forbade U.S. Law enforcement officials to carry weapons on the Mexican side of the border because of the sequels of the Camarena case, where a bounty hunter abducted a Mexican doctor on Mexican soil that had been involved in the abduction and murder and torture of the DEA agent. We now have today customs and Mexican customs and U.S. customs officials side by side on site in Mexico, jointly inspecting cargo so that we try and unclog our congested ports of entry. And the same is true on the Canadian border. Look at what has happened with trusted traveler programs. Trusted traveler programs didn't exist when we negotiated NAFTA. They're not in the NAFTA text, but they have been ancillary developments that have come about because of this very dense economic and trade relationship. If NAFTA goes under, I find it very hard to see a lot of these programs and protocols surviving. And I'm not even going into the political, diplomatic implications of a NAFTA withdrawal. These are some of the day-to-day dynamics that NAFTA has triggered, which could be jeopardized if the U.S. decides to unilaterally withdraw from NAFTA.
Well, let's look at both the highbrow and the lowbrow. They're both important. On the high level, if we look at the other big production centers in the world, they also have other countries they work with to actually produce things. Germany uses Central Europe. It also uses NAFTA. Japan has investment in North America, but it uses production in other countries in Asia. And even China is now using some other countries in Asia as part of a joint production. So it's not, in today's world, it's pretty normal that if you're going to be successful, you actually spread out your production across several countries, which we've done. And then the same thing, I think you could say on the security side. Hardly anybody today can be an island unto themselves and be secure. And even if you look at either border, if you're lining up along the border, it's like the famous Maginot Line, where the Germans just went around it. And you really do need that in-depth defense and in-depth cooperation, and that demands a good level of trust. You have to trust each other. You have to be happy working with each other. You have to treat each other as good neighbors, not as neighbors that you look down on in some sense. I mean, how do you see this in this sort of bigger strategic area?
Well, two things. You talked about the economics. I mean, Mexico and Canada, as referred to in the earlier panel, have now are signing on to Trans-Pacific Partnership. We were somewhat ambivalent about that. There are issues in TPP which we aren't too particularly happy about. We almost left the Japanese at the altar, as they say. It cost us a little bit of our bilateral relationship with Japan, but the government has come around because I think we're facing the fact that NAFTA does have an uncertain future, and we have to diversify. We obviously have our Canada-Europe free trade agreement, and we will be being very actively going for more and more multilateral or bilateral agreements with Korea and Japan and so forth outside of the TPP. So to a certain extent, that's one of the responses that Canada has accelerated in view of potential problems with NAFTA. On the security side, the thing that 9/11 taught us is that security becomes very much part of trade, or trade becomes very much part of NAFTA. They become very interdependent. And I think it was as much 9/11 that spawned a lot of this thinking about the security arrangements between the two countries, and then bringing in Mexico as well because of the huge numbers of people that move back and forth across the Mexican border as in ours, and the concern that people might be infiltrated in those huge numbers of people that would be doing harm to the American society and so forth. And then we became, through the Security Prosperity Partnership, which George Bush and our Prime Minister, and I think it was President Fox that did. It wasn't hugely successful in some areas, but it did bring the security people more and more together in a trilateral arrangement. And we're also seeing signs of the Mexican military now starting to become somewhat more interested in working trilaterally with the two other countries. So I think security, to a certain extent, as a result of 9/11, was the impetus. But as I say, without good security, you can't have trade. I mean, good security enhances trade in this post-9/11 world. So you're absolutely right. Used to be one of U.S. ambassadors after 9/11 talked about the perimeter, and Canadians thought this was a terrible idea because you had the ideas of, the border customs people sort of fencing around and telling who could come into Canada. We've evolved tremendously on that, and as Arturo has said, we're now working jointly in pre-clearance and in sharing information in third countries before people board planes, before they come to Canada, common databases and so forth. So we've moved tremendously in a political diplomatic way from a rather sort of negative way because of the issues that we both have to, had to defend our homeland, but at the same time we recognize that without doing that, we're not going to have a very good internal trading relationship. So all that is good, and the real concern, and I think Arturo has pointed to it, is if NAFTA goes, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we, because of the political kind of recriminations that may come out because we feel let down by the United States being unilateral, by not being prepared to negotiate what we would consider in a reasonable way, is there sort of enough political backlash in Canada to start pulling back and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't cooperate as much? And that would worry me an awful lot in terms of border access and border management. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's one of the things we have to be very careful about. If NAFTA goes badly, and there is no interest in negotiating from the other side, this could have some political repercussions in Canada.
Right. Well, let's just explore that a little bit with Mexico. So we've seen in Mexico that the favorable views of the United States have dropped to the lowest level since they've ever been recorded, at 30% favorable and 66% or so negative. And it's already pretty low. So Arturo, and you have an election coming up. What's going to happen if the United States were to pull out, or if they just continue to treat Mexico in a way that people perceive as pretty shabby?
There are two levels of discussion to this, I think, very important question, maybe even three, but I'll probably focus on two. The first one is reality. And even though President Trump, I think some nights or some mornings would like to press control, alt, delete, and disappear Mexico from south of the border, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And Mexican policymakers and politicians understand this. So there would be some very important dislocation effects of a NAFTA collapse in terms of some of the collaboration that has occurred between both countries, particularly in intelligence and security matters. There's a greater density to the Canadian U.S. defense and national security relationship than there is, obviously, today with Mexico. But stuff like what we've seen, Tony, in the last years, where we finally got Navy and military liaisons to Northcom in Colorado Springs, the type of conversation that has started happening in the mill-to-mill relationship between the United States and Mexico, the type of engagement that the Mexican military has had with the Lester Pearson Center in Canada for peacekeeping, the fact that for the first time in Mexican history, Mexico was committed to sending troops to UN PKO operations, and how they see Canada as a proxy to engage in this, because in that regard the U.S. still is a bit more problematic domestically. All of this could evaporate immediately. The second level is more an issue of the willingness and the appetite in Mexico among political elites to continue building the strategic, forward-leaning relationship that we've been building Lego piece by Lego piece in the past 20th century. And a part of it is this collapsing favorability perception of the United States and Mexico. No country on the face of the earth in the last 18 months has seen such a collapse of U.S. favorable perceptions than what you've seen in Mexico. And you don't need to be Kissinger or Bismarck to figure out why this has happened. But why is this relevant? First, it's relevant in the context of NAFTA. Why? Because we've got a presidential election. Why? Because we will have, for all purposes, a lame duck president and government as of July 1st, the day that we have a president-elect in Mexico. And if you combine the low favorability of the United States with a government that's on its way out and that is being challenged in terms of its engagement with this administration, the wiggle room Mexico may have to accept deals that make or break NAFTA in 4, 5, 6, 8 months may be zero. And that's a huge problem for any government of any color or any stripe. Mm-hmm. And that will also have a repercussion on the willingness of the Mexican government to continue doing stuff that is pretty unpopular domestically in Mexico, like what it has been doing with the United States to deter Central American transmigration through Mexico on its way to the United States. This is highly unpopular in Mexico. The basic gist is, why is Mexico doing the dirty work of the Americans? And so some of these things that play a very important role in creating a North American common domain for security, the types of synergies that we've seen develop between our military establishments. This administration, the Trump administration, loves a particular restaurant, Italian restaurant in Georgetown. I've joked a couple of times that they can afford to go and have dinner at this nice Italian restaurant in Georgetown, because in 2010, 11, Mexico and the United States, working on something that had nothing to do with the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, foiled an Inspector Clouseau, Peter Sellers plot of an Iranian national who was planning to put a bomb in this restaurant to blow up my Saudi counterpart in Washington, D.C. So I sometimes joke, you know, Mr. Trump, you really think that the relationship with Mexico is lousy while you're having dinner at this restaurant, thanks to the type of collaboration and engagement that we have developed, and that sometimes has nothing to do with the very specific, concrete bilateral issues. It is a relationship that has grown and that has started to look in the last years at other global and regional issues which were never part of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda. So you've got a lot of pieces here at stake. Again, I don't think you're going to see a hostile Mexico on your southern border. I think there's a realization that Mexico's success depends on the success of the United States and vice versa. But it will curtail a lot of the stuff that we've been doing, and it may propel the relationship back to something much more similar, like the one that we had in the 80s and the relationship that we've seen since NAFTA and since 9/11. In many ways, if NAFTA does collapse, Tony, I think there will be many in Washington, on Capitol Hill, in state capitals, in cities around the United States, that by the end of this year and next year may be asking a very complex question: who lost Mexico?
Well, I think I think that it's a good question for everybody to consider right now. And just to say that my perception is aligned with Arturo's. We've seen steady progress over the last 15 years for sure, even accelerated in the security and the foreign policy areas. In the 1990s, it started with trade and went to finance. It then had to get more into security, but it was a time of building trust and confidence between the two governments, and there was a real momentum that had been built up bilaterally in recent years, which is, it's not at all destroyed, but it would be a lot harder to maintain in the South, I think, if there are certain outcomes here. So let's switch for a minute and let's look at what we could do, both in NAFTA but also trilaterally, if we do find a solution in NAFTA and we're able to go forward. Where should we be aiming to head?
Well, I think that depending on how a good solution comes out, Tony, that's important, because the positions that, and I take the point from the former USTR, you always start really, really high and then you work your way down. But the positions that the United States have put on the table right now are definitely non-starters from our perspective. There may be some working on rules of origin for autos, and we've been, I think, collaborating very closely with the Mexican delegation on this, and we may be coming up with some joint proposals. Also, I'd just like to say that if NAFTA does collapse, I suspect that the Canada-Mexico arrangements will stay pretty much the way they are through the NAFTA principles, and my guess is that we'll be working fairly well that way. If we can come to an agreement with on NAFTA that is acceptable in Canada, my guess is that we'll have to wait a little while for the politics. Our two countries are going in very different directions right now. Our country is very secular. Your country, from a governance perspective, is moving pretty quickly into more religious kind of involvement in legislation to some extent. Your country at this point is America first. Our Prime Minister is very much going into multilateralism and international engagement. Your country, to some extent, at the governance level, is being more, I would say, socially conservative and raising certain issues that in Canada we're moving in somewhat the opposite direction. I take the issue of right to choose versus the right to life. I mean, we have a Prime Minister now who throws out of his Liberal caucus anybody who's even prepared to talk about right to life. It's sort of the opposite. Even on fiscal matters, we're kind of going in different directions. We're raising our taxes. You're lowering your taxes. We're being more prudent on government in terms of the fiscal than you are because of your lowering it. And we have a Prime Minister who is somewhat different from your Prime Minister, your President, in many ways. Not saying he's better or worse, just these are different. So we have a kind of a philosophic, interesting relationship right now at the governance level. I'm not saying about the people. People don't change that much, but who is in power in Washington versus who is in power in Ottawa. So my guess is that unless the NAFTA negotiations go swimmingly well and we really do get pretty much what we want, I would think that Canada is going to be looking around a little bit more to the Asia. You know, what is it? Foreign policy follows trade. Europe to a certain extent. We've been more profiled in South America than we have in the past a little bit. We've always had an interest in Africa and so on. So while we wouldn't, obviously can't change geography, we're next to the United States, we're family, friends, and all the rest, and closest allies, my guess is that the priorities of our foreign policy will be more outside the region, but probably include Mexico if NAFTA goes well. But as I say, it depends a little bit how these negotiations end up and how acrimonious or how smooth they end up being.
Okay, great. Arturo, and then we'll open it up for questions after your comment.
It's a good question. What can we do? And I think, again, the quick answer to that is it'll depend on what happens with NAFTA. If NAFTA collapses, either, and I hope I'm wrong, either in the 6th round in Montreal or soon thereafter, then I think all bets are off. Again, we won't see implosion of diplomatic ties, but it's going to have a very profound and long-standing effect. So the question of what we can do, I think, is predicated on one or two of the other potential outcomes of what happens in Montreal this week, which is the negotiations continue. Governments are starting, particularly the Mexican and U.S. governments, are starting to signal that the artificial timeline that they had sort of established at the outset, that we've got to wrap this up, which all of us said was impossible to do. I think they've now smelt the roses, the coffee, whatever. They've realized that the Mexican electoral and the U.S. electoral calendars, you can't circumscribe the negotiation to that. So they're starting to signal that there may be negotiating rounds, first of all, later in the year than what was originally contemplated. And there's even been sort of some discussion of, well, we could even wait for the political outcomes in Mexico and in the United States. So that's scenario one, that sort of the can gets kicked down the road and we have a longer roadmap of negotiations. The other one is that we end up with a sort of zombie NAFTA where either because there's litigation in the U.S. as a result of the president's decision to withdraw, or because the new Mexican president says, you know, that's all nice and dandy, but I want to review what has been negotiated, and then that sort of starts a completely different ball game. These are the two scenarios where stuff can be done. The first one, because it's dear and near to my heart, is how the three North American countries can develop a greater foreign policy, global, hemispheric, and sub-regional footprint. Stuff that we can do in Central America. Central America, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most pressing national security issues that countries in the Americas face, whether we're right on the doorstep of the region or whether we're farther away like Canada. Mexico has to step up, the US has to step up, Canada, in taking a hard look at the challenges of security, human security, and democratic degradation that is occurring in the Central American Isthmus. And I think that Mexico, the United States, and Canada, together with other partners in the region, particularly Colombia, can really play a role in looking at this carefully. On the issue of how do we jointly, we've developed, the three countries have developed over the years, phenomenal capabilities in disaster response and emergency preparedness. How do the three North American countries develop a footprint to provide disaster relief and emergency preparedness capabilities in the Caribbean and project them in the Caribbean and in Central America? How can we, where we have, this was easier a year ago, but where we do have common views in multilateral fora, whether it's on climate change or other issues, how do we work together? How do the three of us engage in G20 and rethinking some of the structures of global governance? There are a lot of issues where I think the three countries can start developing a more muscular brand of North American diplomacy. Another area which is critically important, the president has signaled that this is an issue, the US president has signaled that this is an area of interest, is the modernization of infrastructure. We need to upgrade our respective border infrastructures, again, because of the impact it has on the day-to-day flow of goods and services. I always have said, and I said when I was ambassador, that if you look at NAFTA, NAFTA's if you look at NAFTA from the perspective of its trade flows, it's a 21st century edifice, simply because of how production platforms and supply chains have developed. If you look at NAFTA from the regulatory standpoint, it's a 20th century framework, because it was developed in 1994 when the global economy was very different. Amazon and eBay and e-commerce and digital flows did not exist, and it's an outdated treaty, and this is one of the reasons why I think it makes a hell of a lot of sense to modernize it. But if you look at it from the point of view of border infrastructure, in 2008, President Obama signed the go-ahead for the construction of a new railroad crossing on the Mexican-U.S. border. What's stunning is that this new railroad crossing is the first railroad crossing that has been built on the U.S.-Mexican border since the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Our infrastructure is woefully inadequate. And we've got to combine better, improved infrastructure with the technology available to us in the 21st century to ensure that we can do two things at the same time. Ensure common prosperity and the facilitation of trade, and common security by using off-the-shelf technology to ensure that whatever's crossing our borders is inspected in real time in a secure manner without having to open every single cargo conveyance or container that crosses our borders. And this is an area where I think there's a great opportunity. I think President Trump is real about his concern as to what has happened to infrastructure in this country. If we can drive that down to let's modernize how we manage and run and develop our border infrastructure, this could be a huge opportunity.
And Arturo didn't add that on that railway, it was not approved until after I left Mexico in fall of 2015.
It took us, once it was signed, it took us 4 years.
Oh, it was more if you said 2008. So yeah, it's a long time.
The Gordie
So
Gordie Howe Bridge we're talking about, it still isn't built, and that started 10 years ago. So
well, there we go. That's right. It was only one track. And I'll add let me add one of the other items that, especially if we come out somewhat okay, that we need to work on together is workforce development. Because if you think about it, NAFTA got all the blame for all these jobs that were lost, when every serious study shows the jobs were lost because of technology and some competition from China, but not because of NAFTA. But people lost jobs. And why they lose jobs? Because there were no real programs to help them get retrained or redirected or find a new place to work. And that affects all three countries, and especially as we're going to be hit by these waves of new technology, changing jobs, not just eliminating some, but changing others. And if we don't talk together and work on that, we're going to be facing real problems together. Okay, let's take some questions.
The only corollary of this is that what we need to understand is that we can't approach the border with first century BC solutions to 21st century challenges. So.
Okay, right in the center here, please.
Thank you. I'm Ed Gerwin with the Progressive Policy Institute. As diplomats and negotiators, I know that you know the best agreements are win-win agreements, and I guess in the case of the three countries, it would be triple win agreements. President Trump seems to have a different metric when it comes to what's a win and loss in a trade agreement, and that is trade deficits. Now, aside from the fact that serious economists don't really view trade deficits as a realistic measure of the success of a trade agreement, if you were negotiating NAFTA now and you had to deal with what the president is concerned about, kind of the underlying issue of this trade agreement issue, what would all of you do to try to address that basic concern without, having to get into the kind of managed trade that's just anathema to a trade agreement? Thank you.
I'll let my colleagues, I'll talk for a little bit so they can think about it. And I'm going to pitch something. I just wrote an article called You Need an Offense and a Defense for a Trade Championship. And that also means what you describe as a win in trade is actually, it is win-win. Because who's going to buy your stuff if you have, in really dire situations, it has to be an agreement between people, and there's a lot of competition out there. So somebody has to agree they're going to win to buy what you're selling, and vice versa. And the same thing with trade arrangements. There's got to be a win-win element to it, and certainly a win-win element across the three countries here. Yes, many people agree that the trade deficit is not the way to measure it. But one of the very interesting things to just add about this relationship is the degree of combined production chains means that the traditional way of measuring trade deficits don't work. Because if you look at the value added in either Canadian exports to the United States or Mexican exports to the U.S., it really shrinks the traditional trade deficit or eliminates it in some cases because there is such high content from the United States in both other countries, and the same in the United States, a lot of Canadian and Mexican content in U.S. cars. But let me, now that I gave you some time, Arturo, you want to start?
It's a very good question, and I think that both Canadian and Mexican negotiators have been grappling with this question, which is, and I've heard it from very relevant U.S. CEOs when all of this kicked off, which is how do you give the president a win? How can you help him make the case that he has won and that he can nail a scalp on the wall and say, I got what I wanted? The problem is there's very little room when it comes to the issue of trade deficits. For starters, it's a red herring, at least in the case of Mexico. He's banged his drum about the trade deficit with Mexico. Well, the U.S.'s trade deficit with Mexico represents 8% of the total U.S. trade deficit worldwide. So even if you were to fundamentally change the dynamics of those trade flows, it's going to have a pipsqueak impact on the larger trade deficit issue in the United States economy. There are some things that I think you can do in terms of traceability, ensuring that the way other countries that are non-NAFTA players that have established a footprint in Canada, the United States, and Mexico to take advantage of the NAFTA rules, how you trace and how you count some of these products that make it into, whether it's the automotive sector, which is where most of the focus of the president is. There are ways that you can also try and address labor retraining, but it's going to be very limited. The problem is that the threshold for success that the administration has set out for itself as to what a successful negotiation is basically untenable for both Mexico and the United States. The greatest problem here is that I think the U.S. and this president is using a Hobbesian approach to its relationship with its two North American partners, and I dare say with the rest of the world. And that, again, talking about maneuverability and wiggle room, that leaves everyone with a very, very, very small room to try and find accommodation so that you can come up with a win-win-win scenario where everyone can claim that they've gotten something that they wanted. Right before the sixth round in Montreal started about 2-3 weeks ago, it was interesting that I think both the Canadian government and the Mexican government started signaling that they thought there could be some way of addressing the issue, one of the poison pills in the negotiation, which is the rules of origin for automotives, which along with sunset clause, government procurement, and dispute resolution mechanisms are the four poison pills that the negotiators are dealing with as we speak. There's some news coming out today from Montreal that there may be a Canadian proposal on the table which might find a way around this conundrum. The problem is no one actually seems to understand what the proposal is, so I think we're all waiting to see what happens there. But the problem is I think that the president has the U.S. president has painted himself into a corner by establishing as a Rubicon of what success looks like in a renegotiated NAFTA is by focalizing on the trade deficit and using that as the metrics of whether it's a good deal or a bad deal. And that's going to be very complicated to solve.
Building on what Arturo said, there's really two things, one of which we can control and one which we can't. But coming to the point on deficit, it's interesting, Canada, by the Department of Commerce statistics, has a $17 billion deficit with respect to U.S. trade in goods. Yet, I think about 2 weeks ago, President Trump was quoted as saying he talked to Mr. Trudeau, and he said, "Yeah, I understand it's 17 billion, but that doesn't count softwood lumber or energy," which, of course, the point is that was included. So it bringing truth to power is a bit of a challenge in Washington sometimes. Two things. One thing we can control to some extent, and that beyond the sort of clever, crafty Canadians trying to figure out a way of including Asian software in automobiles more and more as being part of a stratagem saying, well, we should put those aside because really that's not really what we're really talking about is what's actually built in North America, and if you do that, you're going to get more American content. Is what we saw this afternoon with the mayors, and that is information. And bringing to as much as you can at the subnational level information as to what NAFTA has done for individual businesses, people, and so forth. And we sent 134, we don't have 134 ministers, we had 134 ministerial trips to every state of the union. I'm sure the Mexicans done the same thing. We got the mayors out there. And little by little, we're trying to convince one American at a time that that NAFTA can be beneficial, and some of the problems relating to the issue of job loss in the United States is, as Tony mentioned, is artificial intelligence, AI, it's chain manufacturing in China, et cetera, is not to do with NAFTA. And that message is starting to resonate more that Mr. Trump now is off the tax thing. He's got his support, he's got his taxation thing. And so the sort of more traditional American entrepreneurs at very different levels are now focusing on the problems of NAFTA. They were worried about tax before, so we're finding a lot of pushback starting to happen, and maybe this might have some impact. It may or may not. That's something which we can control by information. The thing we can't control, and that is what is important, is worker adjustment programs. We are a foreign government. We can't go into the United States and say, well, maybe we can supply some funding in order to assist in transforming workers, hopefully younger, because the older ones have more difficulty, into the information technology. And so that's something that has to come from the United States. But that is the basis of some of the problems. And I think in Canada and perhaps in Mexico, we've been fortunate. We have invested a bit in that, so we don't feel quite the hot breath of international trade, and the arguments aren't there that they're losing jobs, because we have been able, to some extent, to train our people and to be more sophisticated in dealing with the very, very rapidly changing trade relationship internationally.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for being with us. Thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting.